And in the Academic Senate, it is our goal to continue to push forth our efforts towards liberatory education so that the historically marginalized and the underrepresented can be seen and heard in the curriculum. So as we move forward this year, we hope to bridge any gaps between constituency groups and to continue our efforts of liberation for our main stakeholders, the students. So as you move through today's program, we want the faculty to know your hard work and dedication is appreciated, and we hope that you take time to consider all the things you currently do to support our students, as well as some of the new ideas for breaking barriers that you will undoubtedly discover in your sessions that you attend today. Thank you all for your time and hard work, and we look forward to working with you in the Academic Senate and across campus. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome. I'm Audrey Joseph, the president of the Classified Senate, and I'm so glad that we can all be here together today. Continued professional learning for classified professionals becomes crucial in the road to growth, especially in light of being at a new point in our roles as we continue to serve students. As classified, we have time and time again shown our ability to problem solve, rise up to challenges presented before us, and be the foundation in our departments and of our college. In order to maintain and/or reinforce these strengths, professional learning becomes essential, not only for efficiency and productivity in serving our students, but also for our own personal growth and well-being, which can help us better support one another overall. One fundamental goal of the Classified Senate is to ensure that every classified member, whether you're working the help desk, pruning the roses, patrolling the campus, or delivering the mail, is seen, heard, valued, and provided with opportunities to excel both professionally and personally. As your president, I will work strategically and diligently to make this happen. Finally, in keeping in line with this year's theme of breaking barriers, I would like to introduce a new program that is being piloted by the Classified Senate that will support this initiative. It is called People Connecting Over Coffee. Whether you are reconnecting with someone you already know or connecting with someone for the first time, it is our goal to build collegiality and leverage working relationships and simply just take a moment to be and connect on a basic human level. In light of living in a post-pandemic world where distancing ourselves became the norm, we hope that this program will break barriers between us and foster a greater sense of belonging and connectivity. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome to the stage our Superintendent President, Dr. Erica Androgenis. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Oh, come on. Good morning. All right, awesome. It is so great to see so many people here in Sexton Auditorium once again to kick off the fall semester. We've had some breakfast together. We have some awesome water bottles that I heard somebody refer to as you could always use it as a Christmas ornament, so keep that in mind for your tree. And we also have a full program of in-person and hybrid professional development activities ahead of us. And of course, lunch too, so we like to keep you fed. Again, so great to see folks back, like PCC is back, and we are excited to get to work. I want to first offer my personal thanks to the 4 amazing women who just spoke before me. These folks have committed to representing their constituents, which I'm sure they can tell you sometimes is not an easy task, but they are here to support all of you. I deeply respect the work that they do, and I want to recognize them once again for stepping up and leading the college as they do. So big round of applause. You people rock. So today we're going to be talking a lot about leadership, what it is, what it means, and how we can all practice it. I have 2 exciting new programs to share with you that we'll be kicking off this fall. And in a few minutes, we'll be hearing from someone who will begin to help us understand what it is to lead as educators through personal and community trauma. It is, as you will hear, a journey, not a destination. And we as a college community are going to shape that journey together. I had the opportunity to greet our incoming class of 25 new faculty at the new faculty orientation this past Monday. And in my brief comments, I thank the faculty for choosing to become part of the PCC family, because it is a choice to come here and be part of us. And I noted that it was an interesting time to be here at the college, because like all institutions, we are figuring out how to function in a new, dare I say it, for the fear of jinxing it, post-pandemic world. That doesn't mean that COVID-19 has entirely left us. It just means that we are managing it in ways that allow us to return to some sort of normalcy. I say some sort of normalcy because our world will never be the same as it was before the pandemic descended on us in March of 2020. Rather, we need to figure out how we are going to adapt to this post-pandemic world. Certainly, from an instructional and student services perspective, we have increased our skills and delivery of distance education, of distance services. But now what we need to do is figure out what our working environment should be like. Never before has there been such an imperative to think differently about work. The Los Angeles Regional Consortium of the 19 LA community colleges had a retreat on Wednesday, where the lunch speaker talked about the future of work. Well, some of what she referenced involved technology, like working in the metaverse, which I don't think I want to do, just so everybody knows. She focused a great deal of her talk on the changing work environment. She spoke of the 2 national phenomena known as the Great Resignation and the newest term, quiet quitting. One component of both phenomena is the need to address the emotional and physical toll of the pandemic on each of us individually, in addition to the toll on us as a community, and how both the individual and the community experience is changing our workplace expectations and values. We cannot underestimate the impact of how differently the 5 generations currently employed at our college and many institutions, that's baby boom, Gen X, Gen Y, millennials, and Gen Z, view work and work-life balance. She also talked about the need to shift from a work culture that is focused on productivity to one that is focused on both outcomes, what do we want to accomplish, and helping employees to thrive in their jobs. And that's all complicated by the fact that we don't work at Apple or Google or Facebook. We work in the public sector, where we are paid with taxpayer dollars, with very rigid structures that we have to adhere to, like the education code, like collective bargaining agreements, and sometimes very narrow job descriptions. That's not to say the structure is bad. Those structural things are good. But it is difficult to incorporate divergent ideas about what the workplace should be like, and to make changes that require flexibility within such a rigid system. Folks, I don't have the answers, but I have heard from many of you about the need to rethink our work environment and to make it better and more welcoming. I am committed to working on this, even if I don't know how to make that happen at this moment in time. In other words, to paraphrase Bob Dylan, the times aren't a-changin', they have changed, and we need to change with them, but hopefully not at a glacial pace, which is often the case in public sector employment. That said, there are some things we are doing and have done to help us chart that course forward. First, there are some steps we're taking to help improve our connection to each other and to rebuild our sense of common purpose. The first one, Alex Buckle-Hyde asked me to throw out there is, you all got an email yesterday or earlier this week about signing up for The What Huts, those are the information tents we have available next week to our students. Please, if you can, sign up for a shift at a What Hut because we need your energy. And even if it's just to hand a student a bottle of water and send them in the right direction, we'd love to have you with us. As in years past, I will be hosting monthly office hours for faculty, students, staff, and managers. And this fall, I will also be hosting a monthly open forum with the executive team to help dig further into some important topics and to answer questions in a public setting. The first forum will be on September 8th, and it will focus on the 22-23 budget, which the board will hopefully have adopted at their September 7th meeting. Next week, we will be sending a college-wide newsletter providing some news you can use to start your fall semester. And I hope you are already all familiar with the Inside Outside PCC, our weekly email that provides news and events from around the college. These are all efforts to promote transparency and to help information flow freely and completely around PCC. We will also be continuing to find ways to come together informally as a college. Those of you who were around here on campus this summer know about our Lemonade and Treats events, which were hosted weekly by different offices across the college. We saw some pictures of those as we were coming in today. These were so much fun. They started out as an idea of just having a place to have a cool drink and take a break, and the idea grew and grew, thanks to some healthy competition among the various areas of the college who wanted to outdo the other areas of the college in terms of fun. For example, we had casino tables, trivia competitions, outdoor games, and even some miniature therapy horses, which were quite popular. It was so much fun to see all of us coming together and getting us excited about working together. And I want to thank each area of the college for putting so much effort into each event. I can't wait to see what comes next. We will also be starting 2 new leadership development programs this fall. These programs will continue to build out on themes that have already been a major focus for us lately: increasing our collegiality with one another, and growing our capacity to deliver on student equity outcomes. Aspire PCC is a year-long leadership institute that will help Lancers of all stripes, classified faculty and managers, enhance their confidence and grow their capacity to be the leaders they want to be. The program will build on theoretical knowledge of leadership along with a deep skill set of leadership tools. 25 people will take part in this year's cohort, which will meet monthly with individual work in between. Our very own Jason Robinson and Joyce Miyabi, you can't keep those retirees away from us, will lead this year's session. The Equity Anchors program will help our college do more to disrupt racism and bring about racially equitable outcomes. Over 5 3-hour in-person sessions, a group of faculty, staff, and managers will gain competency to engage with equity issues in their jobs and speak out to others to help join in. This program is being led by Dr. Carrie Bolin and the Division of Institutional Equity, Diversity, and Justice. Taken together, these programs will help a substantial portion of PCC's community gain intentionality in their work and their focus on our mission, which is educating every student. The applications will be open next week, so I encourage you to consider that, learn more, and apply. And now I would like to turn things over to another major focus for us this fall and beyond, our need to work from a trauma-informed lens. Individual and community trauma is something that can affect any of us in all sorts of unpredictable ways, and it can often form a barrier to understanding and connection. The imperative to incorporate a trauma-informed approach to how we function as a college was articulated in numerous ways last spring. Earlier this week, my executive team began this exploration, and we are committed to deepening our understanding of trauma-informed practices in the workplace and in the classroom, and especially beginning that dialogue and consideration of what wellness and well-being can look like at PCC. And I encourage you all to join us in this journey. In a moment, to start our conversation today, we will be hearing from our special guest speaker, who will introduce these concepts to all of you. Before I turn the mic over, in closing, I want to thank you for everything you do for the college, all of you, and I count myself very lucky to work with such an amazing group of professionals, and I look forward to an awesome year. But to introduce our next speaker, I'm pleased to hand the microphone to Megan Stodenross, our Title IX Investigator Manager, who will be setting the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in person with everyone to kick off the fall 2022 semester. I am relatively new to PCC, so I hope to meet more of you in person out and about, but my name is Megan Stoudenrouse. I work in institutional equity, diversity, and justice, and I oversee our Title IX efforts related to gender equity through offering prevention education related to sex-based misconduct, ensuring access to trauma-informed, equitable resolution options for our campus community, and providing linkages to specialized support services, both here on campus and in the community. And I'm also pleased to support and steer our efforts here to become a trauma-informed campus. As Dr. Androgenis said, the imperative to become trauma-informed is so timely. As we know, this season that we are living, working, and teaching in is truly unprecedented. The dual pandemics of COVID-19 and racism brought to the forefront of higher education the need to adapt and respond. Here at PCC, our student and community campus climate surveys, partnership resource team, as well as our community excellence grants proposals have really underscored the need for us to continue to acknowledge and repair widespread community trauma that we've all faced and are still grappling with. While there's not a way back, though, there is a restorative path forward. In response to this need, as Dr. Androgenis said, PCC is committing to becoming a trauma-informed institution. Over the course of this academic year, the executive leadership team will engage in training and discussion spaces to deepen their understanding of trauma-informed practices in the workplace and the classroom as an introduction to enhancing wellness and well-being. These initial efforts will truly be focused first and foremost on assessing and supporting your well-being as PCC employees. This exploratory year will also include an invitation to the community to engage in a variety of spaces and a working group to move this work forward. This group will go through preliminary training on what it means to be trauma-informed campus-based practices, and again, with that focus starting on our wellness as employees. This work group will also help us identify different opportunities and assess our readiness as a campus to move forward to the implementation stage of using these trauma-informed principles. We look forward to your participation and contributions in this space and this imperative as we continue to center and support the needs of our community. We are deeply, deeply grateful to have the expertise and assistance of Dr. Brenda Ingram, who is guiding PCC through this transformation. Dr. Ingram is a licensed clinical social worker and an educator with over 30 years of experience working in the trauma, mental health, and education fields. She is the program director of the Relationship and Sexual Violence Prevention Services at USC Student Health, associate director of USC's Counseling and Mental Health Division, and clinical assistant professor in USC's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. She was the co-chair of the Trauma-Informed Los Angeles Steering Committee, and is the chair of the California Alliance for the Advancement of Trauma-Informed Care in Higher Education. Dr. Ingram is a thought leader and a champion for this vital work in higher education. This morning, she will introduce us to really what it means to be a trauma-informed campus, provide some context around this imperative, and help illustrate what this transformation will look like for us. Please join me in welcoming to the stage our keynote, Dr. Brenda Ingram.
So I'm going to try and do this without the mask. Shh. Don't tell anybody. So, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. I have a history with Pasadena and some of the faculty I've met previously, but I was at Pacific Oaks College. How many people know of Pacific Oaks College? I was there for like about 20 years. Wonderful place, so it's great to be back in Pasadena. I also work for the city public health department, so I have a long, rich history, hopefully, in Pasadena. I've been at SC for the last 4+ years, but it's great to be back in my semi-home, even though I live in Long Beach. It's always great to come to Pasadena. A little warmer here, but as opposed to a beach city, but in a great way. So thank you for the welcome. So as you heard, the term trauma-informed, we're going to be throwing that around, embracing it, massaging it, figuring out what it all means. But I'm going to talk a little bit how we ready ourselves to become more trauma-informed by sort of looking at how we take care of ourselves and how our institutions need to step up and take care of us as well. So that's kind of where we're going to start today. Since we did the land acknowledgement, I always try and start with something like that. But I wanted to take a moment, and you can sort of read this to yourself, to just take a moment and really think about what it means to acknowledge the land. And take a moment to take a breath if you haven't had a chance to do that. So I want to give everyone a minute to just sort of breathe and sort of take a deeper understanding of what it means when we talk about land acknowledgement and how trauma is one of the outcomes of the ways that we have acquired land from indigenous people. But again, I won't go into the details because we did that already. We want to make sure that we also respect, but also acknowledge the need for types of reparation, what that looks like, and how we heal. And trauma-informed approaches is a great way of helping us to move forward in that healing process. So, PCC has taken a very honorable yet challenging journey as we move into diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And again, belonging is key to those other terms. We don't always talk about it. But it's also important to understand that taking this approach, we need to look at it through a trauma-informed lens. And so this statement by Dr. Quiros, I think, is really great because trauma is at the heart of diversity, equity, and inclusion work because repeated acts of marginalization, oppression, and racism are wounds that overwhelms one's ability to cope. And so as we are talking about diversity, as we are talking about equity, we need to acknowledge that the outcomes of oppression have been trauma. They have traumatized our communities, they have traumatized individuals, and all of us have experienced trauma at some point in our life. And so I kind of want to put a context around why trauma-informed approaches make sense in higher ed. We have had more conversations around that in the K-12, and a lot of school districts are looking at how to weave in those approaches. But this is sort of new to institutions of higher education, and so you all are sort of leading the charge as we speak, especially here on the West Coast. The East Coast and in the South, there's sort of a couple of steps ahead, but out here, we don't have a lot of institutions that are looking at that. We have been on a journey at USC, but again, a very narrowly defined one in our student health services, but has interestingly enough, organically seeped out into the rest of the campus, who are also looking at how do we become trauma-informed. And so we want to start with a sort of how we situate ourselves in the context of a trauma-informed place by understanding that trauma is not just about acquiring knowledge. There's a lot of facts, a lot of things to know about the brain. We're not going to get into all of that. That could be something we talk about later. but it's really about changing how you view the world. When you start to understand the impact of trauma on development, on the brain, on the body, on the soul, it really changes how you view the world. And so what we're really looking for is this cultural shift, this worldview shift that helps us to understand that we are all helpers, whether we work in classified as faculty, if we work doing supportive services, all of that makes us helpers. And in most workplaces, we are trying to help others in some form or fashion, regardless of what our product line is. And so we want to change how we help people, how we support people. The traditional medical model looked at what was wrong with someone. And so when someone does something that doesn't make sense to us, that startles us, that makes us uncomfortable, we automatically blame them and say, well, there's something wrong with you. What's wrong with you? How can we fix you? And so trauma-informed basically says that we want to shift that paradigm. We want to shift that thinking to look at what happened to the person. And to recognize that the impact of trauma may be leading what you see before you than that individual person. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and how we can make that shift. But if you get absolutely nothing else from looking at the world in a trauma-informed way, is we want you to recognize that things happen to people and that we are inherently good, but things happen to us that push us out of our balance, if you will. Things happen to us that make us act in ways that may not be supportive of each other. And what can we do to support folks and acknowledge that something happened to you? So again, just plant that somewhere in back there and really start to make that shift. Once we've talked about trauma, I found that a lot of people have these aha moments. Like, oh, now I get why my uncle, cousin, brother, sister, mother, whoever, why they did that, why they acted that way, because this happened to them. And that people are trying to do the best they can to heal from that. And sometimes we don't have the right tools to help us with that. And so this is about developing institutional tools as well as individual tools. And so I want to start with just real quick about what trauma is. There's been some criticism that, well, now everything is trauma. And so then nothing is trauma. But the truth of the matter is that there are a lot of dimensions related to trauma. And these just sort of go over some of the 8 general dimensions. But bottom line, what we're talking about are situations that cause harm to folks. That it could be physical, it can be psychological, it can be sexual assault, which is one of the most impactful types of trauma that someone can experience. Most common type of trauma that can lead to the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so because of our relationship to sexuality, to sexual identities, orientation, etc., it's really hard for us to sort of really step back and look at what happened to that individual. We want to judge their responses as opposed to being what we like to call more victim-centered. So any kind of intentional harm or betrayal, and there are a lot of moral injuries that people have that don't get addressed appropriately. And so those can lead to the development of traumatic responses. Any kind of exposure to the grotesque, any sort of sudden loss, could be through an accident, it could be through suicide, or even homicide, can create a traumatic response. Any sort of witnessing, one of the reasons why we are so striving to reduce the exposure of children to different types of violence or domestic violence in the home per se, is because it has this huge developmental impact on their trajectory and really limits folks' potential to reach their highest actualization, if you will. And then learning of exposure to a noxic agent, and I think we all understand what we mean by that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the impact of COVID. And then causing the death or harm to someone else can also create a traumatic response in the person. And you can just look at what happens to our folks who are in the military, with 22 to 23 suicides per day upon returning to civilian life. So trauma can have huge impacts. This is just a sample of some types of traumas that we have. Again, the physical ones are pretty obvious, any kind of injuries. Medical trauma, a lot of foster children, unfortunately, are exposed to medical trauma because they have a lot of medical procedures that could be painful. We see this in preemies as well. Surgery, which is one of the reasons why they knock you out. If you're wondering why they knock you out to have surgery, is because you would fight them when they stuck a knife in you. So that's why we put it as a trauma. Then we have psychological trauma. Social or collective trauma is a good term because it speaks of how trauma impacts a large group of people. And again, initially, that type of trauma we can inoculate ourselves by being connected to others, but if it's ongoing, if it's enduring, then it can break down social networks. And again, we're seeing that with COVID. Changes social norms of communities and things of that nature. There's immigration trauma. Many of our students may have been exposed to that, where there's trauma where they leave their home country, the trauma of traveling to wherever it is they're going to go, and then how are they received by the host country. All of those are points where traumatic experiences live. We have racial trauma, environmental trauma. We have a lot of our communities that our students come from that are exposed to a lot of toxins in their communities. They may live next to freeways. We know that asthma is very high in certain communities. And those are examples of some environmental traumas. I was part of the federal group, the federal government that went to Flint, Michigan after the poisoning of the water, which is seen as an environmental trauma. And pretty much everyone in that community was very traumatized to the points where they didn't want to leave their homes. And it's still an ongoing trauma, even though technically the water is no longer poisoned, but the community feels it's still poisoned. And so even after, we talk about a post-COVID, there's still lingering doubts, concerns, fears around COVID. And so vicarious secondary compassion fatigue is what we all develop as a result of working with folks who have been exposed to trauma. And so having a perspective on wellness from a trauma lens makes sense. So I kind of want to start with this sort of like where a lot of trauma begins is in childhood. Excuse me. And so we want to talk a little bit about adverse childhood experiences, which was a pivotal study, retrospective study out of Kaiser, San Diego in the late 90s. And this study sort of set trauma-informed perspectives on a rapid cultural shift, if you will. And that before this, I've been working in the field of trauma for decades. And so you never saw as much attention to it until after this study came out and some of the findings that, changed how we define trauma, even in the psychiatric manual. It used to be only certain things, and now we realize that the majority of people have had some type of traumatic experience. So out of the Kaiser study that looked at about 17,000 folks, and if you are a member of Kaiser, it's a group that's pretty privileged. They tend to be educated, they tend to be middle class and above, and so they have a lot of resources available to them. And so it's a group that you do not think is having a lot of trauma, but in this study they found that almost 70% had at least one adverse childhood experiences, which is the equivalent of what we call childhood trauma. And those adverse childhood experiences include child abuse, includes substance abuse in the home, it includes untreated mental illness, incarceration, domestic violence, poverty. All of these sort of stressors that happen in childhood are seen as traumatic exposures. And so almost 50% of the population, again, in this study that Kaiser did, and again, you're talking 17,000, so we're talking a really large sample, had about anywhere from 1 to 3. And when you get to about 3 is when we start to talk about developmental damage can occur. And so Philadelphia did their own ACE study because they recognized that the original ACE study wasn't very diverse. It was like 80 to 85% white. And again, people who had privilege. And what Philadelphia found in their urban ACE study is that, which was way more diverse, it was like 60% of Philadelphia are people of color. And so they looked at people from different socioeconomic groups, different ethnicities, and found even higher rates of ACEs. One of the other things that they included was the importance of recognizing the impact of neighborhoods and communities in which you grow up in, not just what happens in the home. And so those particular types of stressors, such as community violence, foster care, being bullied in school, racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination, they found that those stressors increased the likelihood that you were going to have these sort of traumatic responses, and saw a greater rate of ACEs in the population, and in particular populations of color and populations that lived in poverty. And so they sort of coined the thing that where you live matters, even more so than your parents. Where you grow up has a significant impact on your life trajectory. And they found this dose relationship, so that the more ACEs you had growing up, the greater the likelihood that you were going to engage in some what we call high-risk behaviors that put your health at risk and put your life at risk and can lead toward early death. But it's important to keep in mind that there are also protective factors. There's resiliency that balances out the impact of adversity. And so we are not just the sum of our adversity or our ACEs, we are also the combination of our protective factors. And those are factors which mean, good relationships with others, in particular adults, that are going to help you navigate some of this adversity, having a sense of humor, having supportive connections, feeling safe. These are protective factors that can sort of mitigate the impact of adverse childhood experiences. And so when you look at this tree that sort of talks about adverse experiences, you see that this tree is rooted in communities, okay? So communities play a huge role in being protective factors, but also can be factors that add to adversity, if you will. And so within that, these sort of collective historical experiences. And so when we're talking about how people are doing in terms of trauma, we want to include all of these layers, all of these parts as we look at our communities. And so as you see within the roots, there can be community violence, opportunities that are lacking, housing. All of these things are sort of structural issues that come through what we talk about in terms of oppression. And so as you all are moving out into your DEIB initiatives, you want to keep in mind this tree so that we don't get stuck in just looking at the leaves, which are really some of the outcomes, but really looking at how do we address the roots, the root causes of adversity, and how do we help heal communities. What can we do differently? Because typically what we'll do, especially in mental health, is we focus on the individual behaviors. But I want to encourage you to start to look at some of those structural issues that are holding up trauma. And so when we're looking and talking about our community college students, because community college students tend to come more from under-resourced, marginalized communities, they tend to have higher rates of ACEs in those communities. And so we need to keep in mind that as we're working and talking to our students, what contexts are they in? What context do they come from? And then what do we do differently as an institution and in terms of our interpersonal interactions that take into account that their experiences may be very different from ours? What we do know in terms of academic achievement, ACEs impacts that. So community colleges tend to have lower rates of graduation, higher rates maybe of absenteeism, dropout rates, higher rates of physical and mental health complaints. We saw this there's a lot of research, not so much with college students, but with the population in general, that people who have had trauma have higher rates of utilization of primary care than those who have 0 ACEs. So again, it has huge impacts on our physical health as well as our mental health. And so then as we talk about COVID, COVID pandemic is an enduring, meaning it's ongoing. We don't know when it's going to end. I know people put the stake in the ground as this is post-pandemic, but every time we get a surge, and we keep getting surges, that's now going to become the norm, and we're moving into this more endemic approach to looking at COVID, but recognizing that it is a collective trauma. We can't say as of September 1st, all COVID's going to disappear. I would love to say that, but that's not realistic. And so enduring makes it a much more challenging type of trauma, is that we don't know when it's going to end. And so we're constantly dealing with the traumatic response related to COVID. All you have to do is watch the news, speeding, street takeovers, people climbing bridges. Who ever heard of that before, right? And they just opened the bridge and and they had to shut it down. The bridge, the 6th Street Bridge. So there's a lot of things. More gun shootings. We've had more car fatalities, even though there's less cars on the road due to COVID. So there's a lot of behaviors, a lot of things we're seeing that are related to the impact that COVID has had. And again, these high levels of disruption to our lives are one of the outcomes of, again, having to have this pandemic in our lives. So schools going online, just down and out, canceling classes, deaths of family members, and again, for community college, we tend to see higher levels of family members being impacted by COVID because of the nature of the work that they do, again, having to do with equity. And so you see an increase in rates of homelessness, increase in rates of substance abuse. There's a ton of new wine clubs out there that we didn't have before the pandemic. Yay for the wine clubs, right? I'm not here to judge. I'm just reporting. But what you find is that after trauma has started, within 18 months, people increase their use of substances of some kind to deal with the stress, the distress of trauma. And so these are natural occurrences. And again, it's not to judge it, it's to recognize what happened and how do we mitigate those impacts. So for community college students, we know that some of these impacts differ based on their ethnicity. In this study done in North Carolina community colleges, about 8,000 students participated in this. And even though they found that most students did not drop classes, of those that did, 45% were African American, as opposed to 29% for the white students. So again, these impacts hit folks differently. And again, as we're talking about equity, how do we take this into account in terms of programming, in terms of the things that we need to do differently? In this particular study, Black students made up almost half of those who said they cannot access the internet. I feel that I come from a very privileged place, and I could barely access the internet. I even upgraded my internet, and it's worse than what it was before. And I keep getting knocked off of Zoom meetings all the time. Not a bad thing, but not what we're supposed to. You know how they do, I can't hear you. What? What did you say? And so, again, access to reliable internet or Wi-Fi services is based on privilege in communities. And students, Black students, are overrepresented in those who were not able to pay their bills, so we're having more financial issues coming up. They had more challenges around childcare, and I can't tell you, my sister talks about childcare and how it reduced her ability to work because she couldn't find anyone who could take care. Like the places where we used to get childcare, they weren't doing it any longer, or they weren't transporting children. And then we also saw this with our Hispanic students, who also had more folks in their family, a higher representation of people who have had COVID in their families, and what impact that has. Now you have to take care of your elders, yourself, and everybody else. So again, COVID has had significant impacts. In another study that looked at the most common ways that COVID-19 has impacted student lives, what you see is this pattern of emotional health, more anxiety and stress, depression, more so than more materialistic issues related to COVID. It may be hard to read, but more disappointment or sadness, more stress and anxiety, more loneliness and isolation were reported by students. And so we look at the trauma impacts on college campuses for students. We see higher rates of suicidal ideation. And I worked in student health in the counseling program, and within the last 3 or 4 years, we have almost doubled our counseling staff, and it's still not enough folks to handle we have about 48,000 students. And so if those students all showed up in that one door for mental health, it's not going to work. So that's another reason why being trauma-informed is so important, because it democratizes mental health services across the campus, that we all become supporters of mental health in different ways. It doesn't make you a therapist, but it makes you therapeutic. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because again, we've seen a huge increase in suicidal ideation and behaviors by our students. A lot of depression and anxiety. We were going to start screening our students for ACEs this fall semester, as a matter of fact. We're doing a pilot right now just to sort of see how that shows up. But we want to know so that we can do early intervention and prevention work with those students. We see increases in alcohol abuse, and in particular binge drinking, which is one of the most dangerous patterns of alcohol misuse, is binge drinking. We see greater rates of re-victimization. So if they have been sexually abused as a child, they're at greater risk for being sexually assaulted once they enter campus, once they come to campus, or being in what we call toxic violent relationships. So you just see higher rates of re-victimization when people have had early trauma. We have higher rates of dropping out, and then engagement in what we call health risk behaviors. And so that's what happens to the students. But as part of the campus community, we have to look at faculty and staff as a significant part of the campus community. And so according to the American Council on Education, in their survey that they did of college presidents who talked about what were their top concerns going forward, you see that 51% identified enrollment, which is typical. Our enrollment's going down. What do we do about it? But that was also a drop. It used to be 63%. So that's no longer as important. Doesn't mean it's not important, but it's dropped in its significance. And what has shown up is that faculty and staff morale is one of the biggest concerns of college presidents these days, with 45% naming that as a huge issue on their campus. 37% selected retaining faculty and staff, and it was mentioned earlier about the Great Resignation that's going on. We've had a lot of our faculty leave in a short period of time. And mental health of faculty and staff was the 5th most frequently chosen pressing concern, with about 34% of the presidents naming that. So again, these issues around how do we take care of the workforce are paramount as we're moving out of the active part of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's also concerns for food insecurity and housing insecurity for students, and also concerns around the impact of new COVID variants on the campus populations. And so when we talk about burnout of college faculty, there was another study that was done by the Chronicles of Higher Ed, and what they found was that in the wake of the coronavirus, 55% of the faculty said, I'm ready to go. I'm just ready to get out. And it has been challenging. You went from no classes to being online, to being hybrid, to being back on campus, and having fears around my safety, and what does this look like, and how do I do all of this? All of that is like, I'm so done. I'm just so done. And then how do I teach? You know, when did people stop and say, okay, now you're online, teach that class? Okay, when did I get that support? How do I change my curriculum? What does it really mean to be online? You had to do all that on the fly. You know, one of those, you had to fly the plane as you built it sort of situations, which contributes to burnout. And so as you can see from these boxes, that 68% felt fatigued in 2020, and that jumped up to 32%. But this had a huge impact on female faculty, okay? And just think about why. Females are charged with home and work. They don't get a break wherever they go. And so female faculty was reporting higher distress, more thinking about leaving. Among female faculty, the percentage feeling stressed climbed to 75% in 2020, compared to 59% of male faculty. This was almost a doubling of female reported stress. Okay? So again, this pandemic has not been easy. It has taken its toll on faculty. It has taken its toll on staff. So why are we talking about trauma-informed? Why do we need that? Well, trauma-informed says it now has data. There's been research that it improves educational outcomes. Again, more in the K-12 was what most of the research is on, but as we are migrating into higher ed, we're starting to see the pluses. Our students want us to know that they've had trauma. Our provost last year sent out a memo to all of our faculty saying to faculty, let's be trauma-informed, even though the campus has not made a formal statement that they will be trauma-informed, so I thought that was really interesting. Because then, okay, so what does that mean? We haven't done that level. We did do a Trauma-Informed Institute during the summer prior to the pandemic for our student services, for student affairs. But in terms of the whole campus, we haven't had that sort of stake in the ground, if you will, by the president to say we are going to be trauma-informed as you all have had here, which I think is phenomenal. You don't get that at a lot of institutions. But we do know that when our provost sent that out, was sort of telling faculty that we're going to take this approach where we recognize that students have been under a lot of stress. You've been under a lot of stress, and it's still going to be rigorous in terms of our academic outcomes. We're still going to do well, but we can slow it down. You know, we don't have to have 4 or 5 papers due 1 week. Maybe we can spread it out over a period of time. And I, in my role in the Department of Psychiatry, I had a lot of students that came and wanted some sort of a note to the teacher that they are under extreme stress and to please have some flexibility. And clearly, it was just, we were reaching out. It's not a mandate. We're not disability services. We can't order people to do it. But just bringing it to the attention of our faculty, I would say 95 to 98% of the faculty responded very positively in extending deadlines, working with students, and students are just afraid to ask. They're afraid to go to their faculty, because I always say, did you talk to your professor? No. Okay, so let's help you have that conversation, because faculty's there to support students. We know that trauma-informed helps support personal development and well-being for students. It also prevents re-traumatization, inadvertent. We might say something, and I've had it happen where someone says something to a student, they weren't thinking about it beforehand, and the student was very upset. But if they had thought about it from a trauma-informed place or used trauma-informed language, that student may not have been triggered. Again, it's not a guarantee. But again, I've had students that have gotten triggered in their interactions with faculty and staff, or we may have policies that are not flexible, that are not human-based, and therefore those can be re-traumatizing to someone where their life has been controlled by the abuser and now being controlled by the institution. And in their heads, same. And so how do we instill more flexibility to prevent this re-traumatization? And then obviously the important piece is supports faculty and staff's mental health and well-being. These are the 6 guiding principles according to SAMHSA, which is the federal government's the department that focuses on mental health and substance abuse. And so this is what trauma-informed looks like. So these are the principles. And again, these principles look very different depending on the organization, depending on the institution, how that plays out. But these, again, safety is the number one thing. We did a survey with our faculty in student health, and though the institution got high marks for physical safety, they didn't get as high marks for psychological safety. And so that was an opportunity to address psychological safety. So how do we become more psychologically safe for the people that work here and for the students who attend here? So in all trauma-informed approaches, safety is paramount. People have to feel safe or else they can't function. And if you know educational law, that's really one of the tenets of educational law, is that you cannot disrupt the learning environment, that the learning environment has to be conducive, has to feel safe in order for folks to learn. So we want to make sure that we're trustworthy, we're transparent. I think you heard your president talk about things that they're doing to increase that transparency, and how important that is in building trust and feeling safe, okay? No surprises is what people don't want to have. Having peer support, making sure that collegially we support each other. How do we make sure that we are all winners is important. So as you see, these principles get played out depending on what the institutions are, what it looks like, what the product, you will, or the product line, or the mission. And so what we want to make sure is that we start to look at workforce wellness through a trauma-informed lens, because all of us have gone through COVID. There's nobody in this room who hasn't been impacted by COVID. We may have some differences in other individual types of traumas, but we have all gone through this global pandemic. And so we want to make sure that we are working to address our wellness. Again, as we always say, put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you try and help others. So before we start talking about how we're going to rally around and be trauma-informed for students, how are we going to be trauma-informed for faculty and staff becomes paramount. And so there's different dimensions. There's the individual or intrapersonal level, and that might be self-care strategies that we engage in. How are we taking care of ourselves? And we know that that's only part of the picture. And then we have interpersonal levels, like in teams. What sort of restorative justice practices do we have? How do we resolve conflict at the team level, at the colleague level? What mechanisms are there to help us talk? Not just, making reports or Title IX, things of that nature, before we get to Title IX, because the hope is that we don't have to do that if we treat each other more humanely, if we really recognize our differences and put that into account. I think, as the young lady said, treat people as they want to be treated. Something to keep in mind. And then where are we in terms of our institutional levels, our systemic or organizational levels? What policies are there that are hindering our wellness? What are things that are going on at the institutional level that we need to look at that may not support wellness? And then we want to come up with interventions, approaches that, again, we might do before as well as after work, or while we're working, I should say. So what are those looking like? How do we structure those sort of things? Most of us spend most of our time working. We spend a lot of our day working. How do we get that work-life balance back? Even after you go home as a faculty person, my day doesn't end. I got papers to read, and I don't have time to do that necessarily during the day. So there's a lot of things that I'm doing, and even if I'm not reading papers or grading tests, I'm still thinking about what am I going to talk about in that next class? What is the focus going to be? What is the research that I need to do? So I'm constantly thinking and working, and so then on top of that, now you got an email from somebody above you who says, oh, could you please don't read this now. Don't send it now. Okay? That's trauma-informed. You don't send out emails after the workday. You can all put them on timers, and they'll go out the beginning of the morning, but don't send them because I love that. I mean, it shows that we're thinking, but let's take it to the next step. Because I'll see a little tagline that says, you don't have to read this email until, well, I have to read I have to read the email to read that little line that says, don't read this email, And you're laughing because you know what I'm talking about, okay? And when you get a boss that sends you an email, who's not going to read it? I'm going to read it. I may not deal with it, but I'm going to read it. So, Trauma Informed says we don't do it that way. We don't send that out. And so there's different things that you can do that are very tiny changes in our work behaviors that happen while we're at work. So again, those are things that you want to think about. You need to talk about what makes sense in your work environment. Just want to make sure I got all that. So we want to be designed into an organization in a manner that can positively impact the personal and professional health of the employees and create what we call a health-promoting environment. And so again, that's going to take time to think about that. That's going to take time to do that. And so these are just some things to think about for wellness approaches after work. Psychological detachment. How do I leave the work at work? Things to practice. It's not easy, especially for beginners. If you're new to the field, you think about work all the time. That's just it. I'm on the other end. I'm like, I don't want to think about it at all. When that clock clicks gone, I'm gone. And so people say, how do you, because I work in trauma, I work in gender-based violence for, God, too many decades to mention. How do you do it for so long? I said, because when I leave, boom, I do not want to think about it again. Okay? So I make sure I do what I need to do so that when I'm off, I'm off. Making sure that I center relaxation. Some people are off and they feel they got to run the marathon. Clearly, I'm not one of them. Okay? But that doesn't mean that running the marathon is a bad thing. But it's really great to think about how do you just relax? How do you do nothing and not feel bad about it? I keep preaching to people, do nothing. Well, I gotta engage in all these self-care activities. One is do nothing. That's a great self-care activity. Practice it. You'll get it well. And then mastery. How do I build my skill set so that my job, I work smarter, not harder? So taking some trauma-informed workshops would be really great in helping you to start to rethink how do I do the work in a way that is more productive but doesn't take a lot of my time or my energy. I'm working smarter, not harder. So anything that helps you to do your job better will help you in the long run in terms of your wellness. And then control during leisure time. I always tell people, they say, oh, well, what are you doing? I have no schedule on the weekend. Do not schedule stuff on the weekends. I want to just go with the flow, whatever that is. And so how do you do that? How do you structure your leisure time? Okay? And if you don't account for it, it's not going to happen. You have to build it in. And then during the work hours, I don't know if you can see all these. Yeah, I guess you can. So what are some of the things that we need to do? So considering ways in which a job site may be designed to be highly productive while simultaneously promoting employee health. What a concept. What we know now is that there is a mandate from the workforce. Workplaces have to change. They have to. People are leaving. Some of that is generational. Some of that is COVID. And folks are just tired. No more bullying. Bullying is now being called out. I remember when I first started talking about bullying, people would look at me like, that's not one of the federal guidelines that you can't be bullied. Well, who wants to work in a toxic workplace where you're being bullied? It should be, but it isn't. But it has now gained a lot more power in being stated that it will not continue. And so again, these are just some of the aspects of a trauma-informed wellness approach to build and strengthen workplace relationships. That's another key piece, is that when we are supportive and then we're in relationship with others, that is key to trauma-informed practices. And I always have to tell people relationships. Trauma-informed care is about building safe supportive relationships with others, okay? So be it family, friends, or colleagues, you need to have those relationships. That's what makes going to work enjoyable, is when you enjoy working with the people you work with. So how do we do those kinds of things? We want to allow vulnerability. It's okay, be who you are. We don't want to judge as best we can. We want to engage in honest interactions with others, and that's not always easy. We want to interact with integrity. We want to practice empathy, try and understand the other person's perspective. And that's hard to do when you're in pain, and I get that. So first, we deal with our own pain. We want to listen actively. We want to find opportunities for shared professional growth. How can we make this work for all of us? We want to laugh. I usually, when I do a self-care workshop, I always include a section on laughing, where we get coworkers to tell funny stories to each other, and you can just hear the laughter. When folks get together, they want to laugh. And so it's okay to have a workplace where you hear laughter. People are more productive when they are laughing than when they're not. You're like, yeah, right, lady. Seriously, there's research that backs that up, that you're way more productive when you're laughing together. They looked at who was the most productive in the workplace, and it was people who had more fun, who laughed more with their colleagues, were more productive than the workers who did not, okay? And laughing just helps your endorphins, it helps your immune system. Can't talk enough about laughing. That doesn't mean you got to be up there and be a comedian. It just means that even in tragedy, there's humor, and we can always find it. And making sure we have patience, that we have grace with each other. Everybody's going to make a mistake. Everybody's going to be called the wrong pronoun at some point, and somebody's going to use the wrong pronoun at some point. Let's correct it. Let's not judge. Let's not beat people up. But let's, again, be mindful that we need to be cognizant of how that lands on someone else. But also, let's have patience and grace when we make a mistake. You're going to make mistakes. I guarantee you, in the DEI world, you will make a mistake. And so again, this balance between job demands and job resources is dynamic, constantly in flux based on what's going on. And it's on leadership to try and help manage that wave, that dynamic wave that goes through. It's not easy. It's a challenge. And leaders are going to make mistakes. And so again, we want to have grace, but we also want to hold them accountable. So practice. How do we have grace and accountability live together? And so in this roadmap to a well and resilient workforce, this roadmap to a trauma-informed wellness approach, we want to make sure that we start off by figuring out, where are we? What of our organizational assessments tell us where we are in terms of our wellness? And sometimes those learnings are hard to hear, and sometimes they're hard to do. But we also need these benchmarks, because if we start to have these initiatives, we need to know where we're going, and have we met it, and are we better than where we were at, I should say. And so we would like to have those sort of assessments, and there are some out there, especially personal well-being assessments that are focused on workplace. We want a workshop on trauma-informed approaches in higher education and wellness. We need that Trauma 101 so that we understand, what is trauma, what does it look like, how does it feel for us as individuals, what will we notice, and then what are some things we can do to mitigate that. And then we want to form work groups, because no one has the answer. And so together, we create this synergistic approach around trauma-informed. We generate new ideas when we work together with folks, and coming up with some ways that one person may not ever come up with. So if we can have some institutional time set aside for these work groups so that they are part of the institution, you're not doing it on your time, you're not having to come off your lunch breaks, it is part of your institutional workload to work on these groups that obviously are going to support the institution. And then we need to always evaluate our efforts and our activities, which is why we want to get a baseline. So that's pretty much all that I have to say. Hopefully I've set the stage to start to look at these issues. I hope that I have helped you to sort of say, ooh, what is that thing? Let me do that. That sounds like that might be okay, especially as we talk about workforce wellness. This is the time. If you had that in your basket and you said, oh, I could never talk about that, nobody will hear it. Folks are ready to hear it now. Now is the time to address restorative justice, not just for our students, but for ourselves as employees in an institution of higher ed. So thank you so much. Look forward to whatever else we have in mind going forward, and good luck and have a fabulous academic year. Thank you.
Good morning, PCC. My name is Jason Robinson. I'm the Director of Professional and Organizational Development. And I want to thank you, Dr. Ingram, for being with us today and sharing your expertise and insights with us. We greatly appreciate it and look forward to engaging with you in the months ahead. Before we close today's session, I need to share a few reminders, and I promise to be quick. First, please be sure to document your attendance at all sessions. If you're attending an in-person workshop, you will do that by scanning a QR code posted in your meeting room and completing the online form associated with that code. Feel free to practice this now with the QR codes here. Keep in mind that in some of the rooms there will be multiple QR code posters, so you'll need to look at the title and times that are included on the poster. We've also color-coded them to help you out. Breakout 1 posters are gold, Breakout 2 posters are purple, and Breakout 3 posters are navy blue. If you're attending a virtual session, your facilitator will drop a link to an online form in the chat, and that's where you will sign in. There are a few places where you can find information related to the sessions that you've registered into. We sent some reminder emails yesterday. Your Outlook calendar should also have that information, and you can also access it through your transcript on the Vision Resource Center. For those of you who ordered lunch, you can pick that up in the quad at 12:15. For those who did not get to order a lunch but might be hungry, you can check with us at about 12:45. We did order a few extras and might have something for you. Later this afternoon, you're going to receive an email with a very short 4-question end-of-day survey. We would appreciate you taking a couple minutes to share your feedback with us. At any point today, if you have questions or a problem, please email prodev@pasadena.edu. We will be monitoring that email and will help you with whatever it is that's popped up for you. And in closing, I want to acknowledge all of the Lancers who are or who already have contributed their expertise and energy to today's program. You are our favorite Lancers. At least for today. And to all of you participating, thank you for joining us. We're really, really glad to have you with us, and we wish you a day full of meaningful learning. So enjoy.